A young man stepped through the glass doors of the city's most exclusive restaurant. His hoodie was faded, his sneakers scuffed, and his hands carried the subtle wear of someone who had seen harder days. At first, no one seemed to notice. But as he moved further into the room, conversations quieted. Glances turned into whispers. The polished floors and elegant chandeliers now felt colder, sharper, as judgment filled the air. The staff exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of how to react. Then, the manager appeared, walking quickly, his eyes fixed on the young man. Without hesitation, he approached, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. What happened next would leave everyone in that room stunned, and it's a moment that changed everything. Let me ask you this: how often do we judge someone by what they wear, by how they look, or by the assumptions we make before knowing their story? Have you ever regretted doing so? Share your thoughts in the comments. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. This story will challenge your perspective and stay with you long after you've heard it. The restaurant was nothing short of exquisite. Warm lighting from elegant chandeliers cast soft reflections onto polished silverware, creating an ambience that was both luxurious and inviting. Waiters moved seamlessly between tables, their crisp uniforms and precise steps speaking to the high standards of the establishment. The faint melody of piano keys drifted through the air, blending with the soft murmur of conversations. The aroma of freshly baked bread lingered, mingling with hints of rich sauces and fine wine. It was a space where perfection was expected, and anything outside of it felt glaringly out of place. Landon Pierce, however, didn't seem fazed by the polished surroundings. His plain hoodie and scuffed sneakers contrasted sharply with the tailored suits and designer dresses around him, but he walked with a quiet confidence. He didn't shuffle or hesitate, nor did he seem out of place despite the reactions that rippled through the room. His steps were deliberate, his gaze steady, as if he had every right to be there. Yet, the responses from the diners told a different story. A woman seated near the door adjusted her chair slightly, her eyes flicking to Landon's worn shoes before darting back to her companion. At a nearby table, a group exchanged glances, their hushed voices tinged with curiosity. Though their words were quiet, their intentions were clear: this man didn't belong here, at least not in their eyes. One waiter paused mid-step, his tray balanced precariously as he caught sight of Landon. For a moment, it seemed like he might approach, but instead, he moved quickly toward the kitchen, clearly unsure of what to do. The tension in the room grew heavier with every passing second, though Landon remained unaffected. His calm demeanor, combined with his choice of attire, only heightened the quiet speculation swirling around him. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into murmurs. Across the restaurant, heads turned just slightly, subtle enough to seem polite but obvious enough to signal their curiosity. What was he doing here? Was he lost? Or perhaps he was someone who didn't realize what kind of place this was. No one spoke directly to him, but the collective judgment in the air was unmistakable. Let me ask you, how would you feel in Landon's position? Would you keep walking, ignoring the stares and whispers? Or would you leave, deciding the atmosphere wasn't worth the trouble? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next may just challenge how you think about these moments. Here's the continuation of the story, maintaining a clear narrative, emotional depth, and engagement. Underscore 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 underscore. The manager approached briskly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His expression was one of irritation, not curiosity, as he stopped just a few feet from Landon. Without even a greeting, his voice cut through the low hum of the restaurant. We can't have people like you hanging around here. This isn't the kind of place where you can just walk in unannounced. Landon turned his head slowly, meeting the manager's eyes. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. He didn't rush to explain himself, nor did he react defensively. Instead, his response was measured. I'm not here to hang around. I'd like a table, if one's available. The manager raised an eyebrow, as though Landon's request were absurd. A table, he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. His gaze swept over Landon's plain hoodie and worn sneakers, pausing for a beat before continuing, "We have a dress code here. And I'm afraid, you don't need it." The words hung in the air, loud enough for the nearest diners to hear. Some turned their heads slightly, their curiosity barely concealed. Others exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and quiet agreement. Landon, however, didn't flinch. He stood firm, his posture relaxed but unwavering. "I wasn't aware a hoodie disqualified someone from being served food," he replied, his voice steady but firm. The manager's face tightened, his irritation growing with every word. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his tone sharper now. "We have an image to maintain, and frankly, you're making my staff and guests uncomfortable." Across the room, the murmurs grew louder. A woman near the bar leaned closer to her companion, her voice low but audible, "Why doesn't he just go? He's clearly not supposed to be here." Meanwhile, a man at a corner table shook his head, muttering something about standards. "Let me ask you this, have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you before they even knew you? How did you handle it? Did you stay, or did you leave? Share your experience in the comments below." Back in the restaurant, Landon didn't move. He met the manager's gaze again, his calm expression unchanged. But before he could respond, a quiet voice interrupted. It was one of the waiters, standing a few steps away, holding a tray of empty glasses. "Sir," the waiter said hesitantly, his eyes flicking nervously between Landon and the manager. "Shouldn't we at least hear him out? I mean, he's not causing any trouble." The manager turned sharply, his glare silencing the young waiter instantly. "Get back to work," he snapped. Then, returning his attention to Landon, he said, "This is your last warning. Leave now, or I'll call security." The tension in the room was palpable. All eyes were now on Landon, waiting to see what he would do. But instead of raising his voice or arguing, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and folded. "Before I go," he said quietly, "let me leave you with this." And with that, he extended his hand, holding out what appeared to be a simple business card. The manager hesitated, his irritation giving way to confusion. He took the card reluctantly, his fingers tightening around it as his eyes moved over the text. Then, suddenly, his expression changed. His confidence seemed to drain away, replaced by something closer to shock. The manager stood stiffly, holding the card in his hand. His gaze flickered over the text as his confident demeanor faltered. The once sharp lines of his face softened into confusion, then into something closer to panic. He glanced back at Landon, now seeing him differently, though the young man's calm expression hadn't changed. The room, however, remained alive with unspoken tension. A man at the bar shifted forward, his elbows resting on the counter as he watched intently. Across the restaurant, a woman whispered something to her companion, their heads tilting slightly in Landon's direction. And yet, despite the growing curiosity, there was an unspoken agreement among the diners not to intervene. They were spectators now, captivated by the unfolding drama but careful not to involve themselves. The manager's voice, which had commanded the room moments earlier, came out softer now. "You're Landon Pierce?" he asked hesitantly, his tone edged with disbelief. His fingers tightened around the card, almost as if he needed to feel its weight to confirm that it was real. "Yes," Landon replied simply. His voice was steady, without a hint of arrogance or defensiveness. "And now that we've established that, may I have a table?" The question, while posed calmly, left the manager visibly uneasy. He blinked a few times, as though trying to process the situation. The diners, who had been whispering among themselves moments earlier, were now silent, their attention fully on the exchange. Landon's demeanor remained unchanged. His steady composure contrasted sharply with the manager's growing discomfort, and the difference was impossible to ignore. The manager shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat as he attempted to regain control. "Mr. Pierce," he began, his words stumbling slightly, I had no idea it was you. I apologize for the misunderstanding." Landon tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone still even but with an edge that hinted at deeper meaning. I didn't introduce myself when I walked in. You assumed I didn't belong here. The manager's mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came. Instead, he glanced nervously around the room, as if searching for support that wasn't there. Landon continued, his voice cutting through the lingering silence. Tell me something, he said, his tone thoughtful. If I had been anyone else, someone without this name, without this card, would I have been treated the same way? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier curiosity now replaced by unease. It was clear that Landon wasn't just addressing the manager, his words resonated with everyone in the room. Let me ask you this, how often do we let assumptions dictate our actions? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone's expectations of you were wrong? How did it make you feel? Share your story in the comments, because moments like these aren't just about the people involved. They're about all of us, and the choices we make every day. The manager, still clutching the card, finally spoke. You're right, he said quietly. And he stopped himself, shaking his head slightly. I owe you an apology. But Landon didn't respond immediately. He glanced over at the young waiter, who had stood frozen near the back of the room, watching everything unfold. What's your name? Landon asked, his voice softening slightly. The waiter hesitated, then stepped forward. Michael, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael, Landon repeated, nodding slightly. Thank you for the way you handled this earlier. Your kindness stood out. Michael's face flushed, and for the first time since the exchange began, there was a glimmer of relief in the room. The tension hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. Landon turned back to the manager, his expression neutral but his words deliberate. Kindness is free, he said. But its absence can be costly. As the manager stepped away, visibly flustered, a moment of hesitation filled the air. Landon remained where he stood, calm but isolated, the weight of judgment still lingering in the room. Then, quietly and almost unnoticed, a young waiter emerged from the side of the dining area. His steps were measured, his tray tucked against his chest as though to steady himself. Sir, the waiter said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced briefly over his shoulder, ensuring the manager was still preoccupied. Are you all right? Would you like me to bring you some water? Landon turned toward the waiter, his expression softening just slightly. It was a simple question, but in a room filled with judgment and dismissal, it carried an unexpected warmth. He nodded. Yes, that would be kind. Thank you. The waiter didn't linger. He moved quickly to retrieve a glass, but the tension in his body was unmistakable. He kept glancing toward the manager, who was now busy instructing another staff member, his tone sharp as he gestured toward the dining area. Despite the risk of being reprimanded, the waiter returned with the water, placing it gently in front of Landon with a small, almost apologetic nod. Here you go, the waiter said quietly, stepping back but not before Landon met his gaze. Thank you, Landon replied, his voice steady and sincere. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, with a depth that made the moment feel more significant than it appeared. Around them, a few diners noticed the exchange. Some returned to their conversations, their discomfort evident, while others watched intently, their curiosity growing. The young waiter didn't stay long. He quickly moved back to his station, his face flushed but his posture resolute. His act of kindness had been small, but it had shifted something in the room. Landon lifted the glass of water, taking a slow sip, and set it down with a quiet smile, as though acknowledging the moment without words. Now, let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in the waiter's position? Would you have taken the same risk, knowing the consequences it might bring? Or would you have stayed silent, afraid of overstepping? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, it's the smallest gestures that carry the most weight. The manager, still oblivious to what had just happened, returned moments later. But this time, something had changed. Landon's calm demeanor remained, but the quiet defiance in his presence seemed to carry more weight. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly, not enough to be disruptive, but enough to be felt. As Landon glanced toward the young waiter, a faint smile crossed his face. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition. Even in a space where he had been dismissed and judged, someone had chosen to treat him with dignity. And for Landon, that moment meant more than the whispers or stares that surrounded him. The manager returned, his movements brisk and his irritation now impossible to miss. His voice cut through the soft murmur of the dining room, louder than necessary, as if he wanted everyone to hear. "I told you to leave," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "If you don't, I'll have no choice but to call security." A few diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly caught between curiosity and unease. Others avoided looking altogether, their focus fixed on their plates, unwilling to engage. The air felt heavier, thick with judgment and tension. Landon, however, remained unfazed. He stood tall, his expression calm, as if the manager's words hadn't rattled him in the slightest. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate and composed. "Before you do that," he said evenly, his voice steady but carrying a quiet authority, "let me leave you with something." He pulled out a small, pristine card and placed it on the counter in front of the manager. There was no rush in his actions, no urgency to explain himself. It was as though he knew that the card would speak louder than anything he could say. The manager hesitated, his hand hovering over the card for a moment before picking it up. His irritation lingered, his expression still smug as he glanced at the object in his hand. But then, as his eyes moved over the bold letters printed on the card, something shifted. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by confusion. Then disbelief. The room seemed to pause as the manager read the name aloud, his voice quieter now. "Landon Pierce," he murmured, his tone a mix of shock and hesitation. He swallowed hard, his gaze darting back to the young man standing before him. "Founder and CEO?" Landon didn't respond right away. He simply met the manager's gaze, his expression steady, his silence saying more than words ever could. The shift in the room was almost tangible. The diners who had been pretending not to watch were now fully invested, their attention fixed on the unfolding moment. The manager's confidence had all but vanished. His grip on the card tightened, his face paling as realization set in. The weight of his mistake was written all over his features. You own this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Landon replied simply, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "And now, I'd like to discuss how you treat people." The words landed heavily, their meaning cutting through the pretense and judgment that had filled the room moments earlier. The manager opened his mouth as though to respond, but no words came. He glanced around, his eyes darting nervously to the diners who were now watching intently. For the first time that evening, the balance of power had shifted entirely. "Let me ask you, what would you do if you were in the manager's position? Would you apologize and admit your mistake, or would you try to save face? And how often do we make assumptions about others, only to find out later how wrong we were?" Share your thoughts in the comments, because moments like these hold lessons for all of us. The manager's words hung in the air, his tone barely audible. "You own this place?" His disbelief was palpable, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He held the card tightly, as if clutching it could undo the weight of his mistake. The once assured man who had dismissed Landon so easily now stood frozen, his composure replaced by a growing sense of regret. Landon nodded, his expression calm yet commanding. "Yes," he replied evenly, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. "And I think we need to have a conversation about how you treat people." A hush fell over the room. The soft clinking of silverware and quiet murmurs that had filled the space earlier had all but disappeared. Diners who had been quick to glance away or whisper behind their hands were now transfixed. Some exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of surprise and guilt as they reflected on their own assumptions. The manager opened his mouth, struggling to find the right words. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice faltering. "If I had known." Landon raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's the point," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "You didn't know. And yet, you judged me. You assumed I didn't belong here, and you made that judgment based on nothing more than my appearance." His words were deliberate, each one landing with precision, not just for the manager but for everyone in the room. The young waiter, who had stood quietly at the edge of the room, straightened his posture. His earlier hesitance had been replaced with a quiet pride. The small act of kindness he'd shown Landon now felt even more significant. Though he didn't say a word, the faint smile on his face spoke volumes. He wasn't just relieved, he felt validated. Landon glanced briefly toward the waiter, acknowledging him with a small nod. The gesture, though subtle, carried weight. It was as if to say, "You did the right thing." The waiter's chest lifted slightly, his confidence growing in the moment. Meanwhile, the other diners remained in stunned silence, their earlier judgments now weighing heavily on them. A woman at the far table avoided eye contact, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. A man near the bar leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as though trying to distance himself from the unfolding scene. And yet, there was no escaping it, the lesson was there for all to see. Let me ask you, how often do we judge someone based on surface-level assumptions? How many times have we overlooked kindness or failed to act because we were too focused on appearances? Share your reflections in the comments below, because this story isn't just about Landon, it's about all of us. The manager, now visibly pale, attempted to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Pierce," he began, his voice shaky, "I deeply regret what happened." "It won't happen again." Landon tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. "Regret isn't enough," he replied, his voice measured. "What matters is how you choose to move forward. Respect isn't reserved for those you recognize, it should be given to everyone who walks through these doors." The words echoed in the room, resonating far beyond their immediate target. Landon turned his attention back to the young waiter. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Ethan," the waiter replied, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Ethan," Landon repeated, nodding. "You showed kindness when it mattered most. That's the kind of character I value." Ethan's face flushed with pride, and for the first time that evening, the tension in the room seemed to lift ever so slightly. The diners, the manager, and even the staff were left with something to think about, an undeniable challenge to reflect on how they treated others. Landon took a step forward, his calm demeanor unchanged, though his words carried an unmistakable weight. He addressed the room, his gaze shifting from the manager to the rest of the staff. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," he began, his tone firm but measured. "But what happened tonight is unacceptable. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, no exceptions." The room remained silent, the tension palpable as his words hung in the air. Landon's voice softened slightly as he continued, "Mistakes happen, but the real test is what we do afterward. Starting tomorrow, every member of this staff will participate in training, not just in customer service but in empathy." The manager shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado replaced with quiet shame. A few staff members exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension. Landon's words weren't just a reprimand, they were a call to action, a chance to do better. Landon turned his attention to Ethan, the young waiter who had shown him kindness when no one else did. "As for you," Landon said, his voice softening further, "your actions tonight made all the difference. When others hesitated, you chose compassion. That's the kind of leadership I value." Ethan's eyes widened, his face a mixture of disbelief and pride. Landon smiled faintly and added, "I'd like to make you the new assistant manager, effective immediately." The room erupted in murmurs, the surprise and admiration rippling through staff and diners alike. Ethan's wide-eyed expression said everything. He hadn't expected recognition, let alone such a significant reward. The manager's face reddened slightly, though he offered a quiet nod, acknowledging the decision. Landon didn't look for further validation. He glanced around the room once more, his expression steady but thoughtful. "This isn't just about me," he said, addressing everyone now. "It's about how we treat each other, especially when we think no one is watching." As Landon prepared to leave, he paused by Ethan, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You've set an example tonight," he said quietly. "Don't forget the impact one small act of kindness can have." Let me ask you, how often do we pause to think about the ripple effects of our actions? How many lives could we touch if we chose compassion over judgment? Share your reflections in the comments below. Because tonight's lesson isn't just for this room, it's for all of us. With that, Landon turned toward the exit, his steps calm and measured. The room remained hushed, the weight of what had just unfolded settling over everyone present. Some diners stared after him, their expressions contemplative. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if grappling with their own behavior from earlier in the evening. As Landon walked through the doors, still dressed in the simple hoodie and sneakers that had sparked so much judgment, he smiled faintly. He hadn't set out to make a scene or teach a lesson, but tonight had become a reminder, one that even the smallest moments could carry the greatest meaning. As Landon stepped outside the restaurant, the cool night air greeted him. He paused for a moment, still dressed in the same worn hoodie and sneakers that had sparked so much judgment. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, but his thoughts were elsewhere. That evening had been about more than his own experience, it had been a mirror reflecting how often we judge, how quickly we assume, and how rarely we pause to see the full picture. The faces of those in the restaurant lingered in his mind, the diners who had whispered behind their hands, the manager who had let appearances dictate his actions, and Ethan, the one person who had chosen kindness over indifference. Landon smiled faintly as he thought about the young waiter's courage. A small gesture, perhaps, but one that had changed the course of the evening and left an impression far greater than anyone realized. He knew the lesson wasn't just for the staff or the diners, it was for everyone. Judgment is easy, he thought. But understanding? That's where the real effort lies. The events of the night had been a stark reminder of the dangers of assumptions and the power of compassion to bridge the gap between what we see and what we don't. The takeaway is simple yet profound: never judge someone by their appearance. Every person carries a story, and you can't always see the battles they've fought or the triumphs they've achieved. Sometimes, those who seem out of place are exactly where they're meant to be, and the impact they leave might surprise you. Let me ask you this: have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to later realize how wrong you were? Or has someone misjudged you, not knowing your full story? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories that inspire change, challenge assumptions, and remind us of the humanity we all share. And remember, kindness isn't just a choice, it's the best investment you can make in someone's life.